we need to talk about Bill C-5. Because if a Liberal MP is telling us a bill from his own government would make Harper blush, we should probably see what it's all about. So I spent the last week speaking to environmental experts, listening to impacted communities, and checking out what they're all saying. And things are not looking great. It's important to think about this bill in two parts. The first part deals with knocking down internal trade barriers, which is something that Mark Carney has repeatedly promised to do by Canada Day, which is very soon. And that part, while not without its criticisms, is the less contentious half. Then there is the second half, which is the part about speeding up approvals for major projects, and that part? Yeah, that's the one that's got people very worried. And because the government has promised that the first half of this bill will be in place by Canada Day, that means the whole bill has to be in place by Canada Day, and it is being rushed through Parliament, leaving very little time for consultation or amendments. And that is significant because once a major project, whether it's a pipeline or something else, is deemed to be in the quote-unquote national interest, the government gains, as Eco-Justice put it, sweeping powers, including the ability to authorize a project despite potential negative environmental impacts on species, ecosystems, and communities that would not otherwise be permitted. The legislation sets out 5 criteria the government may consider in determining if a project is in the public interest. Yeah, that's right, it says may, including the extent to which the project can, quote, A, strengthen Canada's autonomy, resilience, and security. B, provide economic or other benefits to Canada. C, have a high likelihood of successful execution. D, advance the interests of Indigenous peoples. And E, contribute to clean growth and to meeting Canada's objectives with respect to climate change. This is really, really vague, ill-defined criteria for something that would allow the government to disregard certain serious impacts of a project. It is so concerning that Liberal MP Nate Erskine-Smith had this to say about his own government's bill. And yes, Nate Erskine-Smith was a little bit upset after he was passed over for a cabinet position, but if you've been following his career in Parliament, he has always been a Liberal MP who is comfortable speaking his mind, even if that doesn't follow the government's line. With that said, take a listen.
Eco-Justice has also called the federal government's Bill C-5 a threat to democracy, and no Liberal government should welcome that accusation. Worse, in Bill C-5, in Bill 5 deja vu, this federal government is proposing to shut down democratic debate, curtail committee scrutiny, and jam the bill through the legislature. It would all actually make Harper blush. Liberals would rightly scream, that we would scream if a federal conservative government attempted the same. We are rushing legislation through Parliament under the auspices of an urgent threat, but we aren't willing to put Parliament to work for what, an additional week to get things right? The debate on amendments does not need to be rushed. We could easily extend committee hearings by an additional week, provide resources for the committee to sit every day, and engage in a more thoughtful process to hear from experts, improve the bill, and pass it through the House by Canada Day.
And Nate isn't alone in expressing these concerns. Far from it. We also heard from Indigenous leadership who feel frustrated about how they've been railroaded in this process and aren't being anywhere close to adequately consulted on this bill. NDP MP Leah Gazan held a press conference with several Indigenous leaders yesterday in the foyer of the House of Commons, so here's a few key quotes from that.
I just want to start off by saying that how profoundly disappointed we are in this new Prime Minister, Mark Carney. We were never consulted prior to the bill being drafted.
That 7 days is long enough to provide our First Nations with this bill is absolutely ignorant. It's absolutely disgusting. And it really signifies the relationship that this government sees that it has with our First Nations people. And as my colleagues have quite eloquently described, what will happen potentially in the coming days, weeks, and months is very real. And our people are not going to be quiet anymore.
At this point, we have not had any opportunity to say anything, which is unacceptable, and Canadians should be worried about that. This is fundamentally, this legislation gives the government the ability to do what they want, wherever they want, and to have a committee to review laws that they can exempt, that there's no sense in reviewing something that doesn't apply. It's ludicrous. And to think that Ontario can do the same We were thinking that now Ontario can do the same. We'll have to rely on federal laws to protect some things that are important to us. The waters, the lands. Now the federal government is doing the same thing. So who is left to protect the resources? The federal government is failing us and the province is failing us.
Finally, environmental groups held a press conference today where they raised significant concerns with the legislation. Here's some of what they said.
Yes, we need big transformative investments in projects that benefit Canadians, projects like renewable energy, rail, and an east-west electricity grid, but economic uncertainty can't be used to shut the public out of decisions that affect them or run roughshod over Indigenous people's rights.
The bill requires the federal government to authorize a project with a golden ticket, even if the evidence shows the project would kill the last remaining member of a species. Yes, you heard that right.
On top of all of that, I spoke with Keith Brooks, the program's director for Environmental Defence Canada. In our conversation, he warned me that this bill enables the fast-tracking of projects in ways that circumvent environmental laws that were enacted in response to real problems. Keith said that there are a lot of terms that are not defined or are poorly defined in the legislation, and said that there is, quote, absolutely lots of room for this to be abused. Because to be clear, even though the Prime Minister might provide some assurances in press conferences and stuff telling us that he won't push through a project that Indigenous communities oppose or that a province opposes, you do have to consider what the legislation allows him to do, not just what he says he'll do and who he says he'll respect. Because if the legislation doesn't require that, then not only do you have to trust that he is telling the truth in that, but you also have to trust that any future government that inherits this legislation will also have that same trust, will actually do that level of consultation and will have that level of respect. And I don't think that we should just run on trust when it comes to climate change and Indigenous rights. Definitely not with this country's track record. Anyway, Keith also told me that this bill is, quote, anti-democratic and potentially very highly problematic. And he said that while he understands that the government feels the need to get things done in response to Trump, he added, quote, you don't stand up to Trump by being like him and circumventing democratic process. There was also something that Keith said and that I noticed in a lot of the press conferences, whether it be from the Indigenous leadership or from environmental groups, and that is that environmental groups and Indigenous communities are not opposed to all major projects. It's not just a hard no across the board. Keith told me that you can identify good projects, but it shouldn't be decided by a prime minister, his ministers, and whoever happens to be in the room at that time. In fact, Keith said that there is an urgency to solving the climate crisis, and that is tied to building. We need to build things, but they should be projects that are suited to the world that we want to live in, whether it be 5, 10, 20 years from now. But rather than hearing these concerns from folks like Keith, Indigenous leadership, and everyone else whose concerns I've highlighted today, the government is pushing this bill through the House with limited study. The Bloc Québécois actually even tried splitting this bill in two so that the internal trade barrier part can pass and the government can keep its promise about free internal trade by Canada Day. But they can also take the time to properly study and consult impacted groups on the major projects aspect of this legislation. But that effort failed. So it's clear that the government is just steamrolling ahead here. And given the risk of court challenges from these groups, they might come to regret that. I'm going to leave you with this comment from a young Indigenous woman who had a very important message for all of us when it comes to Bill C-5.
We are the future generations that are going to have to deal with these outcomes from you wreaking havoc on our land. What happens when there's no more clean water to drink? What happens when we can't breathe oxygen in the air? I'm a nurse and I get to see firsthand in my community the detrimental impacts that come with wreaking havoc on the land. It goes right and directly to our mental health and our physical well-being. It doesn't matter if you're First Nations or not. That's applicable. We all come from the same walk of being and we're all humans. And to be human, we all require elements of this land to live. So if the land is sick, we're going to be sick as well. So I think that I know that it's imperative for First Nations youth to be here across the board because this is our land. We don't want this bill, and we are the future generations that are going to govern this land and save it. Our people, that everyone behind me here today, 133 First Nations Ontario has helped save this province since time immemorial, since Canada's been here. And we're going to continue to do that.
What do you think of all this?